As technology redefines the world, accelerates the pace of change, and challenges the status quo, expectations for modern government services, efficient operations, and effective outcomes have never been higher. Agencies are rethinking business and operating models, including the IT environments that are becoming harder to maintain and even harder to secure. Digital government requires intelligent digital infrastructure to bridge legacy and next-generation technologies, to free IT to shape an unlimited future, protect against cybersecurity threats, and deliver new value, capabilities, and experiences to citizens and employees across any device, any app, any cloud. When it's time to turn the impossible into the essential, the public sector turns to a digital transformation partner with 20 years' experience innovating and securing the world's most complex government IT infrastructure as a force for good. Where could an intelligent digital foundation take your mission next?
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Aaron Boyd, Senior Editor for Technology and Events at NextGov, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the next installment of our Up Close series, Conversations with Cloud Leaders. In this special spotlight series, NextGov sits down with leaders across the government to discuss the impact of cloud implementation at federal agencies and the private sector, as well as explore its role in defense and national security. Joining me today to explore his agency's role in this discussion is Gary Barlet, CIO of the U.S. Postal Service's Office of the Inspector General. Gary, thanks for joining us today.
That's my pleasure.
So let's just start off quickly getting a little bit of your history. How did you end up in IT delivery? How did you end up in IT delivery in the government? How did you end up at the post office? And not just the post office, but the Inspector General. You're down quite a rabbit hole there. How'd you get there?
So it's funny, I spent 20 years in the United States Air Force as a communications officer and then a cyberspace operations officer. And when I retired, as I was retiring, I had a friend that was working for the OIG here. And she reached out to me and said, "Hey, Gary, this is a great place to work. I really think you'd be interested." So I went ahead and applied. The CIO position had come open. I was retiring, so it seemed like a good idea. I will be honest with you, Aaron, I had no idea what I was getting myself into. The Office of the Inspector General is a very unique role in government as we oversee other agencies. And I had no idea the journey that I was about to embark on.
So just for the audience, so they can level set, your role as CIO of the OIG is you help IT delivery for the Inspector General's office versus the post office itself. How does the IG's IT systems, their networks, the platforms and the like, relate to the United States Postal Service proper? Are they on the same networks? Are they separate?
So we actually have a completely separate network, and it supports our agents and our auditors as they conduct their business. So we've got 100 and some field offices scattered across the United States, co-located with different postal facilities. So we have agents and auditors scattered across the United States, and so my responsibility is to provide the IT that supports the auditors and the investigators as they're out doing their oversight work.
So if you're sharing facilities, are you sharing some infrastructure? Like, so I'm just thinking of like when it comes time to comply with TIC 3, is that going to be a post office thing that you guys can ride on the back of, or are you separate enough where you have to do your own work there?
We are separate enough and we do all of our own work. We do all of our own reporting. Everything is completely separate. And part of that is just from an independence perspective. Because we're investigating, oftentimes investigating postal employees, it's really imperative that we have that separation so that we don't have to worry about any kind of conflicts of interest as we conduct our operations.
Very interesting. Has it always been that way, or was that an evolution? How did you get to the point where the IG's office had its own IT structure?
Yeah, so this IG started out that way. It's interesting. We're actually very unique in the IG world because of the fact that we have our own network. We're large enough that we can actually, we are able to do that. Most IGs do not have their own separate network, their own separate IT staff. Most IGs ride on their agency's backbone. We're just kind of unique in the fact that because of our size and the size of Postal, it's a little bit easier for us to do that. The other piece of that is, honestly, Postal, their IT infrastructure, they focus on moving mail. So everything is about moving mail, getting mail from point A to point B. So if we were to come in, if we were on their backbone, and we'd come in and say, hey, we need to do this huge data analytics thing that's going to suck up a bunch of computing resources, that would probably cause a little bit of conflict because they're focused on moving mail from point A to point B. So in this instance, having a separate network from that perspective, two completely different missions really just made the most sense.
Yeah, it does. Between the priorities, like you said, and the confidentiality of it, right? Just keeping things separate. So let's talk about the IG's networks and systems then. Can you give us kind of an overview of what we're talking about? How many data centers are you running? How many instances, and platforms, and are you fully in the cloud? Are you still running some of your own stuff? Give us a baseline.
So we're almost completely in the cloud. We've got a handful of systems that we're finishing up doing the migration on, but for the most part, we are a completely cloud-based organization. We have, as I mentioned, we have 105 field locations scattered across the United States. About 105, it changes from time to time. But most of our work is done using commercial circuits. We don't use private MPLS circuits. We use commercial circuits. We encrypt, of course, using VPNs. But from a data center perspective, I don't consider myself having a data center anymore. Almost everything that we have is in the cloud. We primarily use Office 365 and Azure. We do use a little bit of other cloud providers, especially with a software as a service kind of thing from other software providers. But yeah, we like to consider ourselves a fully migrated to the cloud type of agency.
Yeah, I saw an interview you did back in 2018 where you said that your long-term goal was to disappear all the data centers. And at that time, trying to think, 2018 still cloud first, I think, was still in play. But then we got Cloud Smart, right? Which urge agencies to kind of rethink that model and not just focus on closing data centers, but getting the best value they could, even if that meant keeping some on-prem. Did that consideration change the way you think at all, or is going fully off-prem still the best way to go for your IG office?
So there are some things that we're required to keep on-prem. For instance, some of our computer forensics folks, the work that they do, some of the tools that they use for doing computer forensics when they're investigating computer crimes against the Postal Service aren't designed to be cloud type of tools, right? They're designed to be server-based, local workstation-based kinds of tools. So we will always have some things that are on-prem, but for the most part, we have really had a hard push where it made sense, where it was practical, where we could do it, put it in the cloud.
Excellent. And I have some more infrastructure and more, delivery type questions for you, but you mentioned that forensic stuff, and that's just too cool to pass up. So what are some of those cool technologies that your office helps deliver to, your CIO's office helps deliver to investigators and auditors? What are some of the, phone cracking tools or large, encryption cracking AI and the like? What's some of the cool stuff you're using?
Well, I'll be very careful about obviously mentioning anything specifically. We do have tools that allow us. The investigators have tools that allow them to image machines. We do a lot of video, so we do a lot of surveillance video. So, for instance, if we think a postal carrier is, say, stealing mail, we have cameras that will mount in the postal facilities, right, to do surveillance video, and then we have to store and process all of that video. We're actually working on some projects right now using artificial intelligence to help the investigators with that video. So right now, when they record surveillance video, they may record, say, 40 hours of surveillance video, a full week of a postal carrier. Well, somebody's got to sit down and watch through that video to look for, their suspect or to look for suspicious activity. So we're actually working right now and trying to introduce some artificial intelligence tools and some machine learning to help speed that up so that the investigators don't have to necessarily watch all of that video, but maybe look for just a suspicious activity, and then they can zoom in on that and speed up that process a little bit. So we're working with the investigators on that right now. We're actually working with the auditors on something very similar, using cameras to do real-time auditing. So imagine, if you will, right now, today, maybe we get a complaint that says, hey, my mail's taking too long. So some auditors might go out to a postal facility and they'll start walking around and they'll see, oh, well, look, there's a huge backlog at this processing center. Well, that requires someone to fly out there, walk around and physically see that. So now imagine if we could have cameras that were monitoring, say, loading docks. And we teach the AI, the artificial intelligence, hey, this is what a normal loading dock looks like. if it starts backing up, notify us if there's a backup. And then we could potentially send someone out or just, log into the camera to look and go, then call Postal and say, hey, we're starting to see a backup at, say, the International Processing Facility in Chicago or something like that. So those are all projects that we're working on right now where we can use artificial intelligence to help make our agents and auditors much more efficient.
That is interesting. And I wanted to go a little bit into the weeds on that because you mentioned you were interviewing different AI projects. So I wanted to ask two things about the back end of how you're acquiring this AI. One, what is that process, that acquisition process? When you say interviewing, are you doing demos? Is it a phase, like iterative acquisition? Are you interviewing the AI like you're treating it like a person, or how's that work?
So it's really, as we meet with companies and we're going through that kind of that information gathering stage part of the process, trying to do a couple of POCs, as it were, to start testing out the technology and seeing what works, what doesn't, what's in the art of the possible. So it's more along those lines right now, kind of proof of concept, kind of information gathering, proof of concept kind of thing.
Yeah. So when you're doing things like AI and other more emerging tech stuff that's a little more on the edge, do you take a different approach to those acquisitions than, say, just buying straight cloud services or, spreadsheets?
So we do. So a lot of times we'll look for best of breed, companies that have some demonstrated capability in those areas, and we'll sit down and talk with them to try to kind of feel out, what's possible, what can they provide us, what have they already done for other customers. We don't necessarily just write an RFI, throw it out on the street, and hope for the best. That with some of these projects, because they're so unique and so cutting edge. We find ourselves really just trying to connect with companies and then sit down and talk to them about what can you do and what have you done in this space. We get a lot of companies that come in and say, oh, well, I've done something for the New York Police Department. We're not beat cops, right? We're not looking for people speeding or parking tickets or oh, there's a gunshot. We're trying to correlate gunshots. We're doing things that are a little more nuanced and a little more involved, from an investigative perspective. So it just takes sitting down with those companies and having those kinds of conversations. Excellent.
And then the other side of that was the infrastructure. What kind of infrastructure considerations do you need for something like those AI programs? You're already in the cloud, so it's easier to spin up and down. But if you were still on-prem, would you have had the computing power, or are these more low compute kind of tools?
Oh, we absolutely would not have had the computing power if we had stayed on-prem. The other consideration was the fact that when I first got here, when we first started looking at the cloud, one of the things we immediately realized is our backbone, like to all of our field offices, were just way too small. So the first thing we did is we went in and replaced all of our connections with large pipes. So, and the way we did that is we actually just approached the local cable companies and said, hey, we need an internet connection. And we'll take your business package, $35 a month, $40 a month, whatever it might be. And it might be 40 meg, it might be a gig, it just depended on what they had available. And then we just encrypted that traffic and created our own mesh network essentially by doing that. The biggest challenge that we actually have right now is, as we start talking about more and more video, is getting it from point A to point B. That's the big challenge is, we collect all this video. Well, now we want to analyze or do artificial intelligence on the video. So you start trying to figure out, do I need to push that up to the cloud to do that processing, or do I need to get back into some edge computing, right, and get a AI in a box, as it were, and have it in centralized locations, or potentially in every field office, so that the investigators could locally upload their video, and then we could do that processing and that artificial intelligence analysis, right there on the edge, as opposed to trying to push that all up to the cloud. Those are all the things we're kind of going through right now and trying to experiment with.
Yeah, this is one of the things I love talking about, which is that push me pull you of the cloud versus the edge and the whole history of computing, right? We go from IBM mainframe back in the day, but the wires, and weren't enough to carry that infrastructure. The infrastructure wasn't enough to carry that information. So they get to personal computers and decentralized and all this stuff. We're just going back and forth. So yeah, now that you're fully in the cloud, now you're thinking more about the edge again. Mm-hmm. Is it about finding a balance, or is it just do as much as you can for the cloud? Okay, that's as much as we can do there. As much as you can for the edge. By the time we get the edge built up, there's going to be new tech for the cloud. Or are you trying? Is there a reason to be more purposeful about it? Do you get more out of it that way?
So I think really the best approach is to be more purposeful about it, right? And really try to identify what missions, are best where. And like I said, for in this instance with video, just the sheer movement of trying to move all that video. Now, maybe 5, 10 years from now, there'll be new technology that'll allow you to upload a petabyte of video in 10 seconds flat.
When we're on 8G wireless or whatever.
Exactly, right? So that would be fantastic. I don't have that available to me right now. So, it's really that balance, right? But as I like to tell a lot of people, my customers, when we're talking about IT, there's no right answer, because the right answer today is going to change tomorrow. So you just got to be flexible and open.
So we've got a few minutes here left. I'd like to talk about a very recent example of the next day, the whole world changing, which was the pandemic last year, right? So we've been talking about all your field offices, all the work you've done to build up the infrastructure to be able to bring data in and out of those offices and work in the cloud, and then everybody had to go home. So you can't control the pipes at people's houses, right? You can't make sure that everybody's got a large network connection or whatever. And as you mentioned, you're encrypting everything, and everything's on through VPNs and the like. So how'd that go when everybody went home? Did you had to pull back on the use of VPNs? Did you already have a telework structure in place? What was that like? So
we were actually very fortunate. We were a very heavy telework type of agency before the pandemic started. So we had an infrastructure in place that most of our employees had good bandwidth at home because they were used to working from home. So there weren't really any people using 56K dial-up modems or anything like that, right? Most people had decent connections at home. We did have some employees that ran into a challenge when suddenly everybody was home. Kids at school, and for some of those employees, we told them and talked to them and said, look, there's only so much we can do here. Your choices are going to be, go to your local Starbucks, or go to go to another location, or call up your cable provider and bump up your bandwidth a little bit, because there's only so much I can do as your CIO. I can't control, like you said, the infrastructure you have at your house. But fortunately for us, I would say 95% of our employees, the transition was completely seamless, because we've been such a heavy telework agency, and they were so used to working from home, they really didn't skip a beat.
Excellent. So we've got about 4 minutes left here. Let's look to the future. What's next for you, the IG's office, and IT? We talked a little bit about your goals for bringing more AI in, but more broadly, what's the future of the OIG CIO's office?
So one of the big things that we're really pushing right now is kind of along the lines of customer self-service, and trying to deploy technologies that allow customers to do what they need to do without necessarily contacting CIO. Perfect example of that is we have started working with Power Apps, Microsoft Power Apps, and what we've allowed, and they started to allow customers to do is build their own applications. They're low-code, no-code kind of applications. We had a lawyer who built an application that they called the Laws Applicable app. There are certain laws that apply to postal and certain laws that don't, and the lawyers were constantly having to try to figure out, hey, does this law apply or doesn't? So they built a simple little app that they can now look it up on their computer or on their phone, and see, does this law apply or does it not apply? And if it does apply, what do we have to do to be in compliance with it? But that was built almost entirely by a lawyer with a little bit of assistance from CIO. So we're really trying to think about how can we put the power of technology in the hands of our customers and allow them to look for new ways to use that technology without having to pick up the phone and call CIO or open a trouble ticket.
That's amazing. And it does have to tie into OCIO at some point, though, right? I'm just thinking of security and integration concerns. How do you address those without cramping people's styles, right? The whole point of building something yourself is just to get it done. So how do you keep that flow moving?
So we try to create an environment where, the kind of the lanes of the road are predefined for them. The security models are there. We can teach them, hey, use these groups, and if a person's in that group, then they'll get these kinds of permissions. There's certain permissions we're not going to allow you to hand out. So we try to create those lanes in the roads, kind of those bumpers in the bowling alley, and they can kind of, as long as they stay within those, within those constraints. We try to make those constraints as wide as possible, but we want to encourage our users to try to have as much freedom and flexibility as possible. But obviously, it's my responsibility to keep them safe from themselves and keep us safe from outsiders, right? So I have to give them some constraints, but we're working really hard to try to create an environment where they understand kind of the playground they get to play in. And as long as they stay within the confines of that playground, I'm happy to let them play.
And do you have almost like like a JAB style provisional ATO for these things? Like if you stay in this lane, we can give you an authority to operate right off the bat and there's no wait time, that kind of thing?
Exactly. Yeah. So as long as it's built within this environment, I kind of look at it as no different than, you're using Excel to create formulas in a spreadsheet and do things. Excel's already been blessed, right? It's okay for you to use Excel as long as you don't go outside the bounds of what Excel normally does. I'm okay with that. So yeah, that's kind of the model that we're pursuing.
Excellent. Well, Gary, unfortunately, we are out of time, but really appreciate you joining us today.
All right. Well, thank you for your time. It was great.
For everyone out there, stay tuned to GovExec for continued coverage of the federal IT and cloud migration developments. And be sure to keep an eye out for our next video in this series coming soon. For NextGov, I'm Aaron Boyd. We'll see you next time.